Today we are looking at a case from the 1930s, so sit back as we go to the USA. Veronica Gedeon was born in 1917 in Astoria, a neighbourhood in the New York borough of Queens. She lived with her father named Joseph, her mother Mary, and her elder sister named Ethel. She had a modest upbringing and attended the William Cullen Bryant High School. Her parents had come to the United States from Hungary in 1907, a period that saw many Hungarians leaving their homeland and emigrating to North America. Between 1880 and 1920, it is estimated that more than 1 million Hungarians arrived in the United States. They were lured by the possibility of economic opportunities, and American companies were also keen to recruit cheap labour to maintain and expand their industrial potential. Many Hungarian immigrants had the hopes of one day returning to Hungary with enough money to purchase land. Veronica grew into a very attractive young woman and was anxious to improve her lifestyle. When she finished her education, she obtained work as a model. However, she was not involved in the fashion modelling industry. Instead, she posed for some more exotic publications. She was very natural in front of the camera and became a favourite of many photographers who recommended her for various commercial work. Often scantily dressed, she appeared in fictional detective magazines such as Inside Detective and Pulp, and when she featured on the front cover, the magazines would often sell out in stores and kiosks all over the city. However, in 1937, a young woman who participated in this type of modelling was sometimes regarded as someone with little moral integrity. Unfortunately, Veronica's parents divorced just as her career was beginning. Nevertheless, they remained on somewhat good terms and were both determined that they would help their daughters in any way they were able. Following the divorce, Veronica and her elder sister Ethel lived with their mother in a 5th-floor apartment in the Turtle Bay neighbourhood, where in order to try and make some extra money, Mrs. Mary Gedeon took in boarders. Easter came early in 1937, with Easter Sunday arriving on the 28th of March. The USA was still experiencing the latter stages of the Great Depression that had started 9 years earlier in 1929. By the spring of 1937, unemployment was still high, and the economy had taken another downward turn. Industrial production was again beginning to decline, and many people saw their working hours decrease. So Easter would be a good distraction for the many families who had been struggling during these difficult times. Although divorced, Mr. and Mrs. Gedeon had agreed to spend the 28th of March together, along with their daughters Veronica and Ethel's husband, as she had recently married. Mr. Joseph Gedeon was first to arrive at the building on East 50th Street. He was looking forward to spending Easter Day with his daughters, although a little apprehensive about seeing his ex-wife Mary. However, he was surprised as he was unable to enter the building and received no answer when he pushed the bell. He decided to wait for Ethel and her husband. He knew they would soon be there and wondered if the bell didn't actually work. But when Ethel arrived, she too was unable to get any answer. Surely, Mary and Veronica had not gone out. After all, they had made plans. Eventually, another resident left the building, allowing Mr. Joseph Gedeon, his daughter Ethel, and his son-in-law to gain access. However, when they went to the 5th floor, there was also no answer from the apartments. Now becoming slightly anxious, Ethel unlocked the door. She still had a key for the actual apartment, just not for the building. Joseph entered first. He quickly looked around, but nothing particularly seemed out of place. Calling for his daughter, Mr. Gedeon then entered Veronica's bedroom, where he came across a gruesome scene. He discovered the partially clothed bodies of his ex-wife Mary Gedeon and his daughter Veronica. It looked as though Mary had been strangled and stabbed, and Veronica had been strangled. In a nearby room, he saw a third body, this time the household boarder, Mr. Frank Burns, a deaf English waiter who had been stabbed multiple times. It appeared that Frank had slept through the mayhem and was stabbed to death multiple times as he slept. Mr. Gedeon immediately called the police. Although the 20-year-old model was engaged, an investigation into the crime revealed that Veronica had returned intoxicated from a date at around 3 a.m. 50 minutes earlier, Charles Robinson, an upstairs neighbour, had noticed that the door of the Gedeon flat was partially opened and closed it. Detectives believed that Frank and Mary were already dead before Veronica arrived home, and that the attacker had waited for her to return. Despite the fact that the two female bodies were left partially naked, the the medical examiner determined that there was no sign of a sexual assault present on either of the women. Somewhat strangely, by forensically searching the crime scene, the police discovered a sculpture that had been made out of a bar of soap. Detectives initially focused their attention on a young man who occasionally drove for the family. His name was Stephen Butler. He would sometimes take Veronica to her photo shoots, and it had been clear to everyone that he had been somewhat infatuated by her, even though she did not reciprocate his feelings. He was, however, extremely distraught that Veronica had been murdered. They then moved on to another suspect, Mary Gedeon's ex-husband and Veronica's father, Mr. Joseph Gedeon. They had been surprised by his response to the murder. He did not seem to have shown any emotion, and when interviewed, it became apparent that he blamed Mary for the breakdown of the marriage. He was quite a religious man and told the officers that he did not think that his youngest daughter had chosen an appropriate career. Once police had checked these suspects' alibis, they were quickly ruled out. One suspect they started to focus on was a man who had previously lodged at Mrs. Gedeon's apartment and had developed an unhealthy obsession with her eldest daughter, Ethel. His name was Robert George Irwin. He was 29 years old and had been born on the 5th of August 1907 at the Arroyo Seco Park near Pasadena in California. His parents were devoted Christians, and he had actually been named Fenelon Arroyo Seco Irwin after the nearby river and one of his father's favourite theologians, Francois Fenelon. However, much to the disappointment of his parents, he changed his name to Robert George Irwin to honour his philosophical idol, the agnostic Robert G. Ingersoll. The police learnt that Robert's father deserted his family before Robert was 3 years old and left the family completely broke. When a family court judge told Robert that he could learn a trade at a state reformatory, he volunteered and spent 15 months there. He idolised Laredo Taft, one of the leading American sculptors of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Later, he moved in with Laredo Taft's family. As a young adult, Robert had worked for a waxwork company in Los Angeles, where he carved commercial busts of President Roosevelt and other famous figures. He then moved to New York to pursue other passions. He was considered erratic and sometimes violent, and had once tried to emasculate himself using a razor. As a result of this, he spent time in a state mental hospital. Upon his release, he moved into a boarding house owned by Mrs. Mary Gedeon, and while staying there, he developed a crush on Ethel, but Ethel did not return his affection. Disappointed by the rejection, Robert was then admitted to the Rockland State Hospital in Orangeburg, New York, where for 2 more years he received further mental health treatment before being released in the summer of 1936. By this time, Ethel had married a man named George Kunder. Robert, still enticed by Ethel, made a sculpture of her, but after finding out that she was married, he added a cobra to the sculpture, which coiled around her neck. He then enrolled as a student at the Theological School of St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, but was expelled on the 18th of March 1937, just 10 days before Easter, due to his mental instability. After he was expelled, he had rented a room for a day in New York City. The house was just blocks away from Mary Gedeon's apartments, where he had previously boarded. On the day of the murders, Robert had been seen near the East River, where a concerned onlooker spoke to him, as he claimed that he was going to drown himself. He was later seen walking near the building on East 50th Street, where Mrs. Mary Gedeon lived with her daughter Veronica and their boarder Frank Burns. By the 7th of April, the police made Robert Irwin their primary suspect. His picture was distributed throughout New York City, and a wide police search ensued. However, Robert Irwin was nowhere to be found. Police were alerted to a discarded suitcase that was found at Grand Central Station. When it was opened, one of the items found was an alarm clock, which was the only thing that had been taken from Mary Gedeon's apartment. However, as days passed, the police started to think that Robert Irwin had already left the state. His picture was distributed to national newspapers, who needed no excuse to print the story of the triple murder. They knew that placing Robert Irwin's picture next to one of the beautiful Veronica Gedeon would rouse the public's interest in the case and undoubtedly increase their sales. However, it was not until the end of June that a pantry maid in Cleveland State Hotel saw a picture of Robert and noticed the uncanny resemblance he had to a bar boy who had recently started working there. The bar boy went by the name of Bob Murray. He was approached by the maid, and she asked him if he knew about Robert Irwin. Shortly after, Bob Murray cleaned out his locker and disappeared. The maid informed the police, and again the search for Robert Irwin intensified. The public's interest in the case was reignited as the Easter Sunday murders once again dominated the newspapers. Front pages were filled with headlines such as "Slain Beauty," usually accompanied by one of the more seductive pictures of Veronica. The police, however, seemed unable to find their suspect. Soon after, the newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, received a strange call from someone claiming to be Robert Irwin and offering to surrender for a price. The editor from the newspaper figured it was a prank and did not investigate the caller. The mysterious caller then contacted the owner of the Chicago Herald-Examiner, who fortunately took the call more seriously. He arranged a meeting with this person who claimed to be Robert Irwin, and it was agreed that the paper would pay $5,000 and provide Robert with a new white linen suit in exchange for an exclusive story, after which he would surrender. The caller was indeed the suspect, Robert Irwin, and after interviewing him for an exclusive article and confession, the owner of the Chicago Herald-Examiner arranged for him to be flown to New York, where he was handed over to the police. In his published confession, Robert claimed he only ever planned to kill Ethel because she was the dearest object in the world to him, but he had accidentally killed the others instead. He told the reporters that he went to the house looking for Ethel as he wanted to behead her and make a death mask, as he was very hurt by the fact that she did not love him, but he loved her. He explained that while at the apartments, he ran into Mary and they spoke for a while, but he then eventually discovered that Ethel did not live there anymore, and this made him mad. He then strangled and stabbed Mary after she had asked him to leave. When Veronica arrived home, Robert said he strangled her after she used his name, because he knew she would be able to identify him. After this, Robert said that he realised there was another bedroom, which was occupied by the lodger, Frank Burns. He said he went into the bedroom and stabbed Frank to death because he didn't want to leave any witnesses. It was this paid confession that almost sent Robert George Irwin to death by the electric chair. In his later confession to New York detectives, Robert compared himself to a radio. He said, "Bob Irwin is nothing. I am only a receiving set, an extremely imperfect one, which can indistinctly tune in the divine mind. You have heard a radio that isn't working well. You turn the dials and get a squawking. Only once in a while we can get the pure, clear music. My whole idea in life was to perfect myself, so the receiving set could always get the divine music at its best." Robert was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. Upon a mental health examination, he was deemed normal, with no sign of mental health issues. His trial began in the fall of 1938 and sparked much public interest, and Veronica's pictures once again appeared in the front pages of the newspapers. During his trial, Robert Irwin pleaded guilty on 3 counts of second-degree murder, a move he made as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty and as part of a promise that a pair of trousers that he had abandoned in a suitcase left at the Grand Central Station in 1937 would be returned to him. He was sentenced to 139 years in prison, 99 years for the murder of Frank, 20 years for the murder of Mary, and 20 years for the murder of Veronica. He was then sent to Sing Sing prison for a psychological examination. Here, prison doctors ruled him to be very definitely insane. As a result, on December the 10th, 1938, he was moved to Matawan, a state institution for the criminally insane, in Fishkill, New York. Here he lived out the rest of his life until he died of cancer in 1975. With the large publicity around the trial, the case of the murder of the beautiful Veronica Gedeon had managed to focus attention on the exclusion of women from juries in first-degree murder cases in New York. The evening of the initial trial dates began with the announcement by the acting commissioner that out of the jurors, none were women, despite the enactment of a statute expressly allowing women to serve as jurors. One day later, the New York courts began to put women on the jury list for such cases. It is believed that Robert Irwin was captured and brought to justice only because Veronica's extensive portfolio of seductive photos had kept the story on the front pages of the newspapers around the country for months. The publicity ultimately led to his arrest. It is unknown why Robert Irwin received 99 years for the murder of Frank, but only 20 years for the murder of Mary and 20 years for the murder of Veronica. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case